For part one of this module, we'll be looking to answer the question, how do we select an appropriate target behavior? And when we're talking about target behaviors, we're speaking about the behaviors we're looking to change for the better in the future with our students. This can be for individual students, small groups of students in your classroom, or for the entire class. A preliminary question you may have as we approach content in this module is, why do we even need to measure behavior? Similar when we're measuring students' academic growth, we also have purposes of different types of assessment we use when measuring behavior. The first purpose is a screening purpose. Through screening measures from a behavioral standpoint, we're really looking to answer the questions, who needs support and when is an instructional change needed? A second purpose of why we measure behavior is from a diagnostic standpoint. Through a diagnostic lens, we're looking to identify specific strengths and needs to guide your instruction and support to the student. This type of behavioral monitoring answers the questions, how should we adjust instruction, on which behaviors and skills does the student need specific support, and what will you do in the way of your instruction to help support your student? A third purpose of assessment is one that we use every single day, or very frequently, and that is the purpose of progress monitoring. From a behavioral standpoint, we're looking to monitor students' behavioral progress across time in order to improve your instruction and inform your support. We're also looking to monitor, in this case, the fidelity of implementation and student outcomes. Progress monitoring-based measures look to answer the question, when is an instructional change needed? Final purpose of why we measure behavior is to inform our outcomes, to answer the question, did it work? Did our comprehensive behavior support plan, did our class-wide behavioral matrix inform student learning and student behavior across time? Did we accomplish the goals we initially set for ourselves at the onset of the school year? So moving forward, there are key steps in how you measure behavior, and this is what we'll be working through across the parts of this module. Step one, which we'll be talking about now, is how to select a target behavior. Step two then becomes, how do you define a target behavior? Step three is, how do you identify relevant dimensions of behavior? This is an important step. As you identify appropriate dimensions, that should directly inform the direct observation protocol and tool you come up with to progress monitor performance over time. Following that, step four is to determine the best procedures for how you will measure the behavior, given your definition, the dimensions, in the context. That has a lot to do with developing your actual direct observation protocols and tools so that they will work for you. And finally, as Jen will be discussing with you, how do we most effectively summarize our behavioral data to visually represent and guide decision-making in our classrooms? So first, how do you select a target behavior? This really has a two-part conversation, often conducted between yourself, your collaborators, and co-teachers in your classroom. The first part of the conversation is pretty easy, and usually that is to ask folks on your team, what are the challenging behaviors that we're seeing, either with our classroom of students, small groups of students, or individual students. Usually what you'll find after that conversation is each person has come up with, objectively, their own long list of behaviors that they're seeing that they believe are inappropriate in your classroom. There then begins the conversation about how you can streamline and synthesize overall, so collectively you have a group consensus on what your prioritized target behaviors are for positive change. Through that conversation, you should first discuss the social significance. So by looking at and reflecting on the ideas of challenging behaviors in your classroom with your team, you should speak to the social significance changing any of those behaviors will have for other learners in your classroom, as well as for that individual student or a group of students that you're focusing on. You may ask yourself and your team, will changing this behavior increase the student's access to available reinforcement, either from their natural environment, from other students or adults in the classroom? Will changing this behavior allow the student to have access to other environments where other behaviors can be learned and performed? Is this behavior important as a prerequisite for another functional skill? If we change and shape the student's inappropriate behavior to something that is more appropriate, will that be a segue for them to a broader lens of appropriate behaviors? Is this behavior going to allow them to be on a behavioral cusp or on the fence towards more advanced and appropriate behaviors in your classroom? Finally, a pretty easy question is this behavior that we're targeting age appropriate? Is the student significantly behind their same age peers in the way of their social, emotional, behavioral outcomes and manifestations? If a behavior is targeted for reduction, you also need to ask yourself this very important question. Is there an adaptive replacement behavior that we're going to focus on to explicitly teach the student something that is more appropriate given this context in our classroom? And that is an important question, because if you cannot identify an appropriate adaptive replacement behavior for your student based off the target behavior, then you need to go back to the drawing board and identify what would be the replacement behavior, the more appropriate behavior that will meet the same maintaining function for that student as you shape them and shift them away from their current challenging behavior. This list in front of you is not an exhaustive list. The big idea to take away from this slide is simply put, as you need to have a conversation with your colleagues and teammates as you identify the target behaviors that you're observing and witnessing in your classroom. And you need to identify whether or not changing a target behavior will cause social significance for that learner. Will it improve their overall performance in the classroom? Will it allow other students to interact more proactively with that student? And will it allow your overall classroom structure to progress more efficiently? Final question is, do you have the right behavior in place? So if you've identified a list of target behaviors, can you work with your teammates to reduce that list to a select few that you think will have the highest likelihood of change in the shortest amount of time? Part 2 of this conversation with your colleagues and teammates often has to do with you actually prioritizing your behaviors. So once you've had the open conversation about what target behaviors you're actually seeing in the classroom, you should work through as a team a reflective dialogue around the different behaviors and the likelihood for change. This list in front of you is by no means an exhaustive list. It is instead presented to you for consideration as you have these conversations. You may ask yourself and your teammates, does this behavior we've identified pose a danger to clients or others? If the behavior does pose a danger, I would think that it should then be prioritized as one of your initial, if not the first behavior you're focusing on for change. Another question may be, how often does the behavior occur? How long-standing is the problem area or skill deficit for the student? Will changing this behavior produce higher rates of reinforcement for the learner? In other words, will shaping them toward a more appropriate replacement behavior allow them quicker, more efficient access to reinforcers? You may ask yourself, what will be the relative importance of this target behavior to future skill development and independent functioning for the student? Will changing this behavior reduce negative or unwanted attention? Will this new behavior produce reinforcement of significant others? How likely is success in changing this target behavior? Question 8 is also a critical one. As you look at your list of potential target behaviors for your student, group of students, or whole class, you want to be able to ask yourself, what is the feasibility? What is the likelihood of success? And finally, how much will it cost to change the behavior? How much personal time and investment, how much training, how much monitoring, how difficult, effectively, will it be to change the behaviors that you're considering for target behaviors? You may add additional questions to this conversation. Again, the takeaway message from this dialogue is, have we gone through a genuine conversation, and have we identified behaviors we believe can be changed and should be changed for the better? At this point, we'll look for you to go to your activity workbooks for activity 6.1. This is a stop and jot activity. We're going to ask you to select an appropriate target behavior for a select student. First, identify a behavior concern for a student from which you have worked with. Next, identify which behavior or behaviors are higher priorities, and see if you can reflect on why. What you're looking to do is identify, streamline, and target behaviors that will have the most impact for the student from a social standpoint once implemented interventions are in place. Welcome back. This is the Activity 6.1 review. Remember to consider the social significance of a target behavior and consider how you will prioritize behaviors you want to address in your classroom with groups of learners, your whole class, or individuals. Once you've identified and prioritized your behaviors, you will now look to establish a clear operational definition. In other words, how will you make that behavior observable and measurable so that it's understood by a variety of adults in your classroom? That's where this module will now take us.